Welcome to American Shadows, where we uncover history's darkest mysteries. I'm Gabriel.
And I'm Grace. Tonight we're taking you on a journey not just across continents, but through time itself, to investigate what might be the oldest solved cold case in human history.
Imagine a murder so ancient that the evidence lay frozen in ice for over 5 millennia, a victim whose last moments remained hidden until modern science finally revealed the brutal truth.
This isn't just any cold case, it's literally the coldest. A 300-year-old mystery that challenges everything we thought we knew about ancient violence and human nature.
Join us as we unravel the story of a death in the Alps that would remain undiscovered until 1991, when a frozen body emerged from the ice to tell us its haunting tale.
On September 19th, 1991, two German tourists, Helmut and Erika Simon, were hiking in the Ötzi Alps along the Austrian-Italian border. What started as a routine mountain trek would soon become one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in history.
The couple had veered slightly off their planned route when they spotted something unusual protruding from the ice. At first glance, they thought they'd stumbled upon the tragic remains of a fellow mountaineer, perhaps someone who'd lost their way in recent years.
The body was face down in the ice, partially exposed, with only the upper torso and head visible. The altitude was over 10,000 feet, and the area was known for its treacherous conditions. Mountain accidents weren't uncommon here.
Local authorities were notified, and what followed was, frankly, a comedy of errors. Initial recovery attempts were carried out with ski poles and ice axes, tools that would make any modern archaeologist cringe.
But here's where things get interesting. As they worked to free the body from its icy tomb, the rescuers began noticing things that didn't quite add up. The clothing wasn't modern mountaineering gear. The equipment scattered around the body looked primitive.
When archaeologist Konrad Spindler first examined the remains at the University of Innsbruck, his heart nearly stopped. The leather and fur clothing, the copper axe, the arrows, these weren't just old, they were ancient.
Carbon dating would later confirm what seemed impossible. This frozen man had died more than 300 years ago during Europe's Copper Age. They weren't dealing with a modern mountaineering accident. They had just discovered Europe's oldest known natural mummy.
But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. As researchers began their meticulous examination, they found something that transformed this archaeological wonder into something far more sinister: evidence of foul play.
The man we now know as Ötzi wasn't just remarkably preserved, he was a walking time capsule of Copper Age European life. Standing at 5 feet, 5 inches tall, he was about average height for his time, and analysis showed he was around 45 years old when he died.
His body tells us a fascinating story of survival in ancient Europe. His skin was covered in over 60 tattoos, simple lines and crosses that some researchers believe were an early form of acupuncture, possibly used to relieve joint pain.
And speaking of pain, Ötzi was dealing with quite a few health issues. He had arthritis, parasites, and several healed fractures. His teeth showed signs of multiple childhood illnesses, times when his growth completely stopped due to malnutrition.
But perhaps most remarkable was his clothing. Ötzi wasn't just wrapped in random animal skins. He was wearing a sophisticated outfit designed for high-altitude travel. His coat and leggings were made from goat and deer leather, stitched together with animal sinew. He even had a bearskin cap.
The tools he carried were equally impressive. His copper axe was a status symbol, showing he was likely a person of importance. He carried a fully equipped quiver with arrows, a dagger with a flint blade, and even a backpack frame made of hazelwood.
The contents of his stomach gave us an incredible glimpse into his final days. His last meal consisted of ibex meat, einkorn wheat, and herbs. The presence of pollen in his digestive system helped us track his movements in his final hours.
But what's particularly interesting is that this wasn't just a man caught in a storm or lost in the mountains. The evidence suggests he was well prepared for high-altitude travel, carrying medicines, tools for making repairs, and even spare arrow shafts.
His fingernails showed he had suffered 3 episodes of severe illness in the last 6 months of his life. The final one occurred about 2 months before his death. He had been through a lot, but he was a survivor, at least until that fateful day in the mountains. But what exactly happened on that fateful day? The truth began to emerge in 2001, when an X-ray revealed something extraordinary. An arrowhead lodged in Ötzi's left shoulder, precisely where the subclavian artery would have been.
This wasn't just any injury. The arrow had struck from behind, piercing through the artery and causing massive internal bleeding. The trajectory suggests the shooter was positioned lower on the mountainside, carefully taking aim at their unsuspecting victim.
And this wasn't the only evidence of violence. Ötzi's hands showed defensive wounds, deep cuts that suggested he'd been in hand-to-hand combat shortly before his death. There was a serious wound to his right palm, the kind you might get trying to grab a blade.
Perhaps most telling was the severe head trauma, a blow so forceful it caused a cranial fracture. This injury alone could have been fatal, but combined with the arrow wound, Ötzi's fate was sealed.
DNA analysis of the blood found on his clothing and tools revealed an even more complex picture. There were traces of blood from at least 4 other individuals. He had been in a serious fight, and not everyone walked away unscathed.
The forensic evidence paints a clear picture of his final moments. After engaging in close combat with multiple assailants, Ötzi managed to break away and attempt an escape up the mountain. But his pursuers weren't finished.
The arrow struck him as he fled, and based on the forensic evidence, death would have come quickly. The subclavian artery would have ruptured, causing him to bleed out in minutes.
The position of his body when found, the defensive wounds, the multiple attackers' blood, all of this points to one conclusion. This was no accident. This was a deliberate, calculated act of violence.
What's particularly chilling is the expertise of the attack. The arrow struck a precise, lethal point, suggesting his killer was skilled with a bow. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was an execution.
But what would drive someone to commit such a calculated murder? The evidence points to several fascinating possibilities, and each one gives us a glimpse into the complex social dynamics of Copper Age Europe.
One compelling theory centers around tribal conflicts. Analysis of Ötzi's belongings shows he came from the south side of the Alps, but pollen found in his digestive tract indicates he had recently traveled between valleys.
Crossing territorial boundaries in those days wasn't as simple as it is now. Resources were scarce, and tribes were fiercely protective of their hunting grounds and copper mining sites.
Speaking of copper, that brings us to another intriguing theory. Ötzi's copper axe was an incredibly valuable item at the time, equivalent to a luxury car today. The purity of the copper suggests he had connections to the emerging metallurgy trade.
Could he have been involved in a dispute over copper trading rights, or perhaps he was seen as a threat to someone else's trading territory?
What's particularly interesting is that his attackers took none of his valuable possessions. The copper axe, his fine bow, his precious flint dagger, all were left with him. This suggests the murder wasn't a simple robbery gone wrong.
Then there's the personal vendetta theory. The blood of multiple people found on his clothing suggests he'd been involved in several violent confrontations before his death. Could this have been revenge for a previous altercation?
The careful planning of the attack, the positioning of the archer below him on the mountainside, the precision of the arrow shot, all point to someone who knew Ötzi's movements and had prepared for this moment.
As for the killer's identity, while we'll never know their name, the evidence tells us quite a bit about them. They were skilled with a bow, familiar with the terrain, and likely knew Ötzi's routines.
The killer also had to be someone physically fit enough to pursue Ötzi up to an elevation of over 10,000 feet, and given the multiple blood traces found, they probably didn't work alone.
What's fascinating is that this murder, committed over 5,300 years ago, bears all the hallmarks of what we today would call a premeditated crime. The planning, the execution, the escape, it's all there.
In many ways, this ancient cold case shows us that while our technology and society have evolved dramatically, the basic motives for murder, power, resources, revenge, have remained chillingly constant throughout human history.
You know, Gabriel, what strikes me most about Ötzi's case is how it shatters our romantic notions about ancient civilizations. This wasn't just a simple society of peaceful farmers and hunters.
Absolutely. This single case reveals complex social structures, trade networks, and unfortunately the same kinds of violent conflicts we see today, 5,000 years later, and human nature hasn't changed all that much.
It's both fascinating and sobering to think that the first cold case we've ever solved is also one of the oldest known murders in human history.
And that wraps up our journey into one of history's most remarkable cold cases. You've been listening to American Shadows. I'm Gabriel.
And I'm Grace. Join us next week when we explore the mysterious disappearance of the Sodder children on Christmas Eve, 1945.
American Shadows is produced by Shadows Media. Our research team includes Mark Stevens and Sarah Chen. Sound design by Alex Rodriguez.
Until next time, remember, every shadow has a story.